Welcome everyone to this fireside chat as part of the Open Publishing Festival running this week and next week in all time zones and all places. My name is Cameron Nayland. I'm coming to you from Perth, Western Australia, where I'm sitting on Whadjuk Noongar lands, and I'd like to acknowledge their elders, past, present and future, and their continuing care for this unceded land. My guest today is Simine Vazire, who is Professor in Psychology Department at the University of Melbourne, a journal editor, and also co-founded the Society for the Improvement of Psychological Science. So welcome, Simine, and can you tell us a little bit about why you started this society?
Thanks, Cameron. It's great to be here. Yeah, it's been an interesting 10 years or so, especially the last 10 years in my field of social and personality psychology and psychology in general. So I was, I think, already faculty member on the tenure track at the time that the so-called replication crisis kind of started happening in psychology. And it was an interesting time to be in psychology and to be doing social and personality psychology in particular, which was kind of in the eye of the storm. And we were having a lot of discussions about replications and transparency and open data and research practices at our conferences, and having many, many debates, and what started to feel like kind of circular conversations and not a lot of action. And so I reached out to Brian Nosek, who was already, very active with the Center for Open Science and so on, and asked, is there a place where we can meet and work on things to improve the situation, make it easier for people to engage in better and more open research practices rather than just having conversations about it and arguing about it. And so we decided to co-found this, what turned into a society. Originally, we planned to have a meeting, see if people show up, see what happens. And we had our first meeting in 2016 with about 100 people. And we decided at the end of that meeting to form a society and went from there. So it was kind of to try to turn all this negative energy and angst and frustration and conflict into something more productive and helpful and forward-looking. And I think that SIPS has really grown into that. I'm no longer all that involved in SIPS. I'm not on the board anymore. I'm not that involved. I'm the editor of the journal that's affiliated with the society, but it runs, completely independently of me and Brian now, and it seems to be doing great.
So going back to where you started, so presumably there was a time before you started getting frustrated with the state of science as you saw it then, but what got you into the science and psychology in the first place?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I grew up in the States mostly, and when I was in university, I'm getting an echo, Cameron. I don't know, you want to mute. So I was in university at Carleton College in Minnesota, and I think I was kind of fascinated with the idea that you could scientifically study these really complex questions, like why do people do the things they do and why are people different from one another and so on. And maybe a little bit shocked that you could get traction on such complex questions with empirical methods, which in retrospect, I now see that kind of undergraduate skepticism and shock about whether this is really scientifically tractable as very well-founded and something that we kind of unlearn sometimes as we go through our training. But actually, that is maybe the right mentality to approach such complex social science problems, and probably in other areas of science as well. But I just know my area, where I think a great deal of humility towards our research questions and how hard they're going to be to answer is appropriate. But I found it really fascinating, and especially the research methods side of it. So I was really fascinated by when can we just ask people what they're like, and when do we need to go beyond self-reports? So a kind of technical way of thinking about it is the accuracy of self-reports, but a more philosophical or maybe interesting way to think about it is the limits of self-knowledge. Like, what can we reasonably expect people to be able to accurately report on about themselves? So I've always had a pretty deep interest in methodology and the limits of what our methods can do. So the replication crisis and the concerns over, the suitability of our methods didn't come out completely out of the blue for many of us. For me, it was a focus on self-report methods. For other people, many people had already been working on trying to improve different aspects of research methods. Another big one around that time in my field was the whole idea of over-reliance on college students from North America or similar cultures and that if we want to make generalizable claims, we need much more diverse samples than we were getting. So there was a lot of conversation around those things anyway, and I find those puzzles and challenges really exciting and fascinating.
I guess so that led you to a position at UC Davis over time, which is, I guess, where a lot of this started and a lot of this happened. Was there a particular experience that really led you into this this movement to sort of lead reform and be engaged in that process?
There were a lot of ones. I mean, I think for many of us in my subfield in particular, there were a few keystone events, like there was a paper in our flagship journal that claimed to find evidence for extrasensory perception. That was a pretty big kind of flashpoint for our field, a few cases of fraud, et cetera. But yeah, so for me, a big part of it was becoming a journal editor and seeing how the sausage is made. And, I think I wasn't too idealistic about it before. I knew that there's status bias and there's all these other issues that factor in. It's not a level playing field. It's not a totally fair game. There's a lot of randomness too. But when I became editor-in-chief of a journal, so I became editor-in-chief of a social and personality psych journal in 2015. So I was already pretty active in this at the time, but I think for me, it was very much an eye-opening and I would say disillusioning experience in many ways, although it's also a very motivating force to see things that I think not many people get to see and think, oh, actually the problem is maybe even bigger than we realized. And for me in particular, the experience was a combination of getting pressure from senior people in the field to not to go easy on other senior people. So the very explicit status bias that we shouldn't be stepping on important people's toes, that this is going to hurt the reputation of the journal if you desk reject famous people's papers, et cetera. And also seeing, I mean, actually that wasn't that surprising to me, but seeing people endorse this so openly and act like, well, what else can we do? Our hands are tied. And I saw it happening at other journals as well. It wasn't just a one-off, but I remember when a particular person was made editor-in-chief of a prominent journal, and that person had a track record of questionable judgment. And some of us raised questions about why this person, they said, well, when so-and-so volunteers to be editor of your journal, you don't say no. And that kind of attitude of there's certain people whose work can't possibly be desk rejected or who you can't possibly say no to if they want to take on a gatekeeping role or things like that, I found really frustrating. And, it's kind of like when you're growing up as a kid and you realize that your parents are fallible or can make mistakes, like realizing that the people running our societies and our journals and making these decisions of appointing editors and caving to pressures and saying, oh, well, I know that it's not, maybe the most scientifically oriented way of making a decision, but what else can you do? I'm like, what do you mean, what else can you do? You can do a lot of other things. But it was really interesting to me to see how even people with a lot of power felt that their hands were tied. And it made me realize that the incentives and pressures and norms and culture are really deep, and to the point where even people who actually have a lot of choice and power still feel like they can't do otherwise. So it really puts into perspective, I think, how brave and how much risk earlier career researchers are taking when they stand up to this system, which is one of the things that I really wanted to help provide kind of a community for people who are taking those risks, because I think it's so admirable. And there's so many people who should be in a position to do that and aren't doing it. And instead it falls to people earlier in their careers.
I was going to say, so around this time, you said around 2015, you were, am I right in thinking you were still actually on the tenure track at that point?
No, I had tenure. So yeah, I had moved from Washington University in St. Louis, where I was when this whole kind of replication crisis started. I was there until 2014 or so, and then I moved to UC Davis. But I got tenure at WashU before I moved to Davis. Yeah. So I wasn't taking, I didn't, for me, the replication crisis hit right when literally 2 weeks after I submitted my tenure materials is when I found out about the p-hacking paper, false positive psychology. That was also another kind of flashpoint in my field. So by that point, everything I was going to do for tenure was done, and anything I did after that was pretty safe. So I was one of the lucky ones.
I mean, you mentioned early career researchers, and I guess this has been a theme in your work throughout in many different ways, in perspectives of society, the journals, the work you're currently doing as well in Melbourne. Is there something specific about that moment? Many people talk about the moment when you get tenure and then are notionally free. And then, as you say, many people seem less actually to feel that power as they become, again, more senior beyond that. Is there something in that moment that actually does provide that kind of freedom?
I think it does. I mean, I don't think you feel like overnight all of a sudden things are different and you can take risks. But I think as it starts to sink in, just how much security you have, at least in the American system, I think it's a little bit different in different places. But in the American system, tenure really does give you a huge amount of job security. And so I think a lot of people don't treat it that way and don't use that freedom to take risks, especially risks on behalf of other people. But I don't, people say, well, you're still in the same incentive structure, right? You still need to publish in certain journals for your graduate students and so on. And I absolutely understand that. I participate in that too. I make compromises about where I publish my work, what journals and societies I do service for, partly because I don't want to burn all my bridges, because I want to be able to train PhD students and have them have a chance to get a job and so on. But I think that still there are other ways, even without penalizing your own trainees, that people with tenure should be able to take risks and stand up for things that is much harder to do without tenure.
So then, yeah, so you moved from some of these other journals to become involved in Collabora. So what was it that attracted you? Well, could you tell us a bit about Collabora and how it operates, but also, what was it specifically that attracted you to that project?
Yeah, so I first learned about Collabora when somebody at UC Press, Dan Morgan, who has moved now, but he approached me about potentially starting an open access journal. And actually, originally it was going to be not just specific to psychology, but eventually it became a psychology journal. And I really like the idea of open access journals. It fits with my principles and values. And also this journal was going to be a place where we could be more progressive in other policies, not just open access, but other ways of being more open and transparent. And so I got involved with that with Rolf Swan. We were originally the senior editors. And then eventually it became a psychology specific journal and became affiliated with SIPS, and I became editor in chief. We shifted the structure around a bit. I like several things about the model of Collabora. So I mentioned it's open access. It does have an APC, which I really want to move to a different business model where authors don't have to pay, but we do give waivers to people who don't have funds for the APC. But I also like that in addition to requiring certain kinds of transparency from authors, so we have the default policy is that your data should be shared publicly, as well as your materials, code, things like that, although we make exceptions in cases of ethical concerns. But we also try to hold ourselves to a higher standard of transparency. So for example, we engage in transparent review. So all of our published papers, the peer review history is published along with it. We also give authors permission to share the review content and decision letters, even if it's rejected. So we won't publish it if the paper is rejected, but they can do whatever they want with it. Because I think that there's these like very ambiguous norms around when it's okay for authors to, for example, post publicly comments on their own paper, which I find really frustrating, because then you hear these like rumors about, oh, this journal treated me badly, and other people saying, well, then show us the receipts, and then people saying, well, I don't know if I can. And so I think it's actually better for everyone, the journals who are behaving well too, for this to all be transparent. So we do those things. We name handling editors on all papers and things like that. So we're looking for ways to not just ask for transparency on the part of authors, but also be held accountable ourselves and make sure that when what we do is verifiable. The parts that, there's some things like, it came up recently actually about whether editors should be able to have back channel communication with each other. That's not part of the transparent peer review process. That was a really interesting thing to think about. What are the pros and cons of that? Or for example, we don't require reviewers to identify themselves. They can choose whether to sign their reviews or not. When we publish the peer review history, it's up to the reviewer to decide whether that includes their identity or not. So there's still some kinds of lack of transparency, I guess. You have to think through what kinds of transparency are good for science, what kinds might actually be harmful or neutral or things like that.
I mean, that's a really interesting question in terms of, you mentioned, data sharing and the ethics of data sharing and when it's not ethical to share that data, and this question of, what's required to be transparent around selection processes, but also to take care. I mean, I guess, do you have a view on this ongoing conversation about whether editors should be editing referees' reports where they're, you know, over the top, in some cases abusive. How do you see that working?
Yeah, I have very strong opinions about this. So I know Dan Hamilton, who's the first author on a paper that came out about this recently, surveying journal editors about what they think is acceptable or not. And my view is that editors should never edit reviewers' reports. What they should do in the case of inappropriate comments is either just don't use the review and, you know, never use that reviewer again if it's really extreme, or if there's no way to contact the reviewer, or if you think that maybe it was an honest mistake or the reviewer could be educated to do better or something like that, then reach out to the reviewer, say, here's the problem, can you rewrite it? Or are you okay with me editing it in this exact way, and get the reviewer's consent to do that. And if they say no, then don't use their review. Yeah, I think that it's just a very slippery slope if editors start editing. I mean, first of all, it's misleading. That it should be clear to authors what's coming from the editor, what's coming from the reviewer. And then it just can lead to so much, justification of like, oh, well, I think the reviewer meant this. And sometimes that's sincere, but wrong. Sometimes that's motivated reasoning, etc.
Yeah, so about the same time that you were becoming editor-chief and collaborator, you also moved here to Australia while we're on this time zone, in the Open Publishing Fest. And what brought you to Melbourne, and how is that work evolving now? Yeah,
so I moved to the University of Melbourne in the middle of the pandemic, actually, and I haven't actually moved to Melbourne yet. I'm still in Sydney, where my partner lives. But I'm going to Melbourne next week, and I'll start going more often and move there soon. It's been weird having a new job for a year and a half where I haven't actually been on campus or met most of my colleagues face to face. But I really like the department at the University of Melbourne. I had my partner lives in Sydney, so that was, being closer to him was a factor. It was a really exciting opportunity. The group there, it was a great fit for me, both in terms of my substantive work, so the social personality group, the ethics and wellbeing hub in my department, and then Fiona Fiddler and I have a joint lab. So she's in a few different schools, including the School of Historical and Philosophical Studies of Science. And so we have a joint lab called MetaMeld that's like a very interdisciplinary, so includes researchers in philosophy of science, history of science, sociology of science, and then researchers in ecology, ecosystems, evolutionary biology, as well as psychology, of course. So we have a great time discussing many of these issues from multiple different perspectives. So that was a huge draw for me too.
Yeah, and I guess you've moved into this broader field of metascience in general. I guess can you tell us what you mean by metascience?
Yeah.
And where you see that going in the future?
Yeah, I think it's a really exciting time for. It's controversial to call it a field because there are already fields that do a lot of what, now gets under the umbrella of metascience or meta research. So maybe it's a consolidation or an attempt to kind of create an umbrella around researchers who are studying science from different perspectives. Maybe one way in which when we use the phrase metascience specifically, we're more likely to be talking about people who maybe have an activist agenda to try to improve science or reform science or research, which isn't necessarily present, for example, in science studies or history of science, et cetera. And I think there's a lot that we can do to work together. I think that those of us with maybe an agenda, I don't know if agenda is the right word, but like who have a driving force that has to do with fixing problems or something like that. I think there's a lot we can learn from the fields that are observing and reporting on science from a little bit more of a distance. And vice versa. I think there's a lot that now, having been in the trenches, especially in the peer review trenches, but also the lab and so on, I read, philosophy of science or sociology pieces, things like that, and think, I think that it could be informative for these people to hear more about the on-the-ground reality that's very different than the textbook kind of version of science, which I'm sure they know, but some of the details are hard to get if you're not in that field. So I think the inside versus outside perspective is one that I don't know where exactly metascience falls, but maybe a little bit more inside, like people who have been engaged as substantive, in the primary field that's not metascience before turning to metascience. That might be more common. And I've lost your video, but I'm just going to keep talking. I think that there's a few, just such a broad umbrella term or field, if we want to call it that, that includes things about like studying individual research practices. There, you're back. As well as studying things like peer review and other systems and institutions, how hiring and promotion works, research evaluation, stuff like that, as well as publishing, and then statistical practices. There's just so many varieties of things that fit under the metascience and meta research umbrella. And I'll keep going since I can't see you again. In terms of the future of metascience, I think that's also, it's going to be really interesting to see if it becomes more of an established field with things like departments and degrees and centers and so on. I'm hoping that we see more of that, because I think there's a lot of, again, early career researchers who are doing really excellent work in this area that doesn't really have a disciplinary home. There aren't hiring lines or promotion lines or grant funding mechanisms or journals specifically for this kind of work. There's some very close, things like scientometrics or other areas like that where it could fit in, but has a slightly different kind of history and background than some of the metascience that came out of fields like psychology.
Cool. I think I've got my technical issues like that, for the moment at least. So where do you see this going next? What would you like to get into, and where are you headed in the future?
Yeah, for me personally, I think journals and peer review are still kind of my most interesting area of work. I would love to figure out how to improve how we evaluate science. And I think that might actually mean something very different than the traditional journal. I think research evaluation is moving to, preprints are really pushing the issue. COVID made that really salient, that we need to be able to evaluate research independently of journals, or maybe in addition to how journals evaluate research. So sometimes just because it's been published, even in a very prestigious journal, doesn't mean that it's necessarily up to the task that people want to use that finding for. And so we need more vetting than just the stamp of a journal. So making peer reviews transparent is one way to do that, so that other people can see the criticisms, but continuing to do peer review beyond just the formal accept reject decision of a journal, or maybe even not having the accept reject decision at all, and just having everything be posted as preprints. Publication happens, there's no gatekeeping, and then evaluation happens on top of that. I think that's probably the future. I don't know what the transition is going to look like, but that's what I've been thinking about lately.
So thanks for that. Yeah, I think transitions are always the hard part, I guess. Yeah. Well, good luck with the future. Thank you for being with us. For those of you who are listening live, do look out for the rest of the Open Publishing Fest, including more fireside chats, including one with me and Daniela Lowenberg from the California Digital Library next week. If you're listening asynchronously, then look at the calendar for openpublishingfest.org for other material, and look for the playlist for the fireside chat series. So thank you, Simine, and thank you all.
Thank you.
I just got to press a whole bunch of buttons.